Hello again, everybody. This is a read-along with Jordana, and I am currently reading The Girl in Red by Christina Henry. Page 1, Chapter 1, The Taste of Fears. Somewhere in an American forest, which seems like a pretty standard fairy tale beginning. I get it, it's fiction. The author wants you to imagine it could be anywhere. And I bought that too at first. But now, I'm convinced it's happening in my backyard. Page 5. There's a little hint of dialogue that made me first think, maybe it's not as vague as it seems. This is where Red has encountered the, quote, coyote. Already, coyotes only live in certain parts of the world. That's a clue. I didn't think much of it, though. Coyotes are pretty much everywhere. But this little hint of dialogue still went ding, ding, ding in my head, you'll see. That smells good, he said hopefully. He being the coyote in this case. Sure does, Red replied. Sure does, Red replied. Maybe it's because I'm from rural Vermont. Maybe it's because I sometimes have a little bit of an accent myself. But how many people reply with sure does? Sure does. Now, between that and page 21, there isn't a whole lot that would give away Red's location except for a small note that says she's moving north. Not a big deal. Page 21, though. Next to the window were 3 wooden shelves. And on the bottom, there were plates and cups and bowls made of metal and painted blue with white speckles. At this point, my confirmation bias is going crazy. I know exactly what the author is trying to describe. Exactly. You know why? Because my family has those things. We have those camping equipment. We have it. On top of that, it describes a camp stove and some cans of propane. We have that camp stove. It's green. It has like a little metal stand. You hook up the green can of propane. It is literally what we have. So now I know it's not a big deal, but I'm thinking like, oh my goodness, maybe she's camping in the Northeast like what we always do. Okay, even then, not a big deal. As I was reading through the book, I didn't think a whole lot about where is this book specifically taking place, because again, it's a work of fiction. It could be anywhere, right? Wrong, because then on page 35, there is a quote that says, "Life just went on like nothing exceptional was really happening in the world, even though a big city about 100 miles south of them had been hit hard already." Why would the author say 100 miles south of them if she wasn't thinking of a specific location? Now, I get it. The author doesn't want to think of a very specific location. Okay. But she obviously, when she was writing this, had something in mind. Otherwise, she would have just said big cities around the country or a big city somewhere down south. No. She says a big city about 100 miles south of them. She's obviously thinking of something. Now that I was on the hunt, I couldn't help but think back to a previous clue that the author had included. On page 27, talking about Red's mother. Mama was an English lit professor who taught classes on Shakespeare at the Little, in parentheses, Little, which meant prestigious and ridiculously expensive and mostly populated by white kids from rich families, college on the other side of town. How many little, prestigious, mostly white colleges can you think of? Page 35. Red also says that folk in town gave her funny looks when she went to the pharmacy or the grocery store with a huge pack and sleeping bag on her back, but then they gave her funny looks anyway because of the color of her skin and because of her legs, so that wasn't anything new and exciting. Okay, so lots of things for people to look at her funny for, but one of those things is her skin color, which is previously mentioned as being nondescript but not pale white, which means that she's definitely living in a place that is mostly populated by white people. Now this is when I thought I was really onto something. On page 62, it says that she did not want to survive the cough only to end up with Lyme disease. She is in a place with ticks, but not just any ticks. She is in a place with deer ticks, which carry Lyme disease, which is only in part of the United States. The West has lots of ticks. The Midwest has lots of ticks. The South has lots of ticks. But only the East Coast of the United States and some of the Midwest has Lyme disease carrying ticks. Look at this great map of Lyme disease courtesy of LymeDisease.org. Page 43. It was just part of aging, nothing especially unique about it, but Red had worried about the two of them, her parents, in that house so far out of town, especially when winter came and their quarter-mile driveway would need to be plowed before anyone could even run to the grocery store for milk. So not only is this on the East Coast, this is in the Northeast, someplace that gets snow, or maybe that little part of the Midwest that gets Lyme disease too. So how many places are in the Northeast that count as small, rural, prestigious, white colleges? A lot, actually. The good news is that the author gives us another clue on page 42. It says, Red shouldn't have stayed home and attend her parents' college. She knew that. She'd been accepted at better universities than Adam, her brother. Much better, actually. And she'd been very mature about not rubbing it in his face. No easy task when she'd been 17, because her grades had been outstanding. But she'd been worried about them, her parents, being alone. In other words, this can't be too prestigious. It's not an Ivy League school. She could have gone to an Ivy League school, is what this is saying, and she didn't. So that means we're looking for small, prestigious, white, liberal arts, northeastern colleges that are not Ivy League schools. And you know what comes to my mind right off the bat? Middlebury College in Vermont. Sure does. Does this book take place in my beautiful, wonderful, mystical homeland? Well, Jordana, how come it can't be Lebanon, New Hampshire? They have Dartmouth. Vermont and New Hampshire have a very loving rivalry with each other. The two states are very similar, except one is upside down and one has better maple syrup. Actually, I had that thought too. You see, Lebanon, New Hampshire is only about 100 miles north of Boston. And earlier in the book, she said there was a major city about 100 miles south of where Red lived. However, Lebanon, New Hampshire is not that small. Dartmouth is not that small. And I'm pretty sure Red's parents don't teach at an Ivy League school, which Dartmouth is, because it said that she could have gone to a much better school if she had wanted to. The problem, though, is that if Lebanon is only about 100 miles north of Boston, Middlebury, Vermont, where Middlebury College is almost 200 miles north of Boston, which doesn't quite fit in with the author's description, because then she would have just said there was a major city 200 miles north of them. So I Googled it. Middlebury is actually about 100 miles north of Albany, New York. Not as major as Boston, but still a big city. Well, Jordana, there are small, prestigious liberal arts, mostly white colleges in the northern Midwestern part of the United States, too, where they also have Lyme disease, as you mentioned is an important hint the author gave us in this book. As if Lyme disease could be something to be proud of for once. Well, the author gives us another important clue. On page 35, if someone she, Red, knew and liked about it, and asked about it, she just said she was getting ready to do a through hike, like when people got it in their heads to walk the whole Appalachian Trail. And then they would exclaim how exciting it was and that they hoped she had a good trip. The author is not saying that Red is saying she is hiking the Appalachian Trail, or she would have just said that. Instead, she is saying that she's doing a through hike, like the Appalachian Trail, which means that she lives in an area where people know about the Appalachian Trail, aka the East Coast, but it is not the Appalachian Trail. What could that be? The Long Trail, which is through Vermont. Well, then you might understandably wonder why the author doesn't just say the long trail. Well, I think this is one of those situations where the author is trying to reach a broader audience. Now, obviously, the author doesn't want just the 5 people that live in Vermont to be the only people that read her book. So more people would know about the Appalachian Trail as opposed to the Long Trail. There are some other clues that could indicate it is indeed Middlebury, Vermont, as opposed to these other places. For example, on both page 30 and also page 38, the author talks about how Red has to trek through state and or federal wooded lands. Now, there is a lot of that everywhere, including upstate New York. So I'm thinking, well, as long as Middlebury, Vermont meets all of those other requirements, then maybe it is indeed Middlebury, Vermont. Look at all this great state and national forest, courtesy of googlemaps.com. Unfortunately, there are some issues with this theory. We know from page 13 that Red needs to travel north. We also know from page 38 that she needs to travel about 300 miles due north. So if she's starting her trek in Middlebury, Vermont, 300 miles due north is probably going to put her up in Canada. And the author doesn't say anything about crossing national borders. If she goes to the east, she'd also have to cross some areas of civilization, which the author doesn't mention either. And if she goes to the west, then she's going to have to cross Lake Champlain, which the author also doesn't mention. That's an issue. However, if Red cuts northeast, like at a diagonal, then maybe her grandmother lives in the great north woods of Maine, and then she wouldn't have to cross any major city centers. Not that there are really any major city centers in Vermont anyway. She wouldn't be cutting across Lake Champlain, and she also wouldn't be up in Canada either. But there is an issue even with that idea, because on page 101, by the time you get here, it says that Red has traveled further than she thought. She's not that far from Grandma's house. It says that there's a whole bunch of oak trees. And oak trees don't really grow that much in Maine. Well, I'm about to start chapter 7, and so far I'm going to stick with my Middlebury, Vermont thesis. That might change as I continue. I think that she started in Middlebury and is cutting northeast into the great north woods of Maine, and I'm going to chalk up the oak tree thing to a simple ecological misunderstanding on the part of Christina Henry, the author. But I could be wrong. What are your thoughts? Do you think maybe this is taking place in Wisconsin or Minnesota? Let me know in the comments below. Sure does.